The sun was shining brightly over the Thompson household, casting a warm glow over the large backyard. It was the day of the annual family BBQ, and everyone was in high spirits. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter as family and friends gathered around the grill. The smell of sizzling burgers and hot dogs wafted through the air, making everyone's mouth water. The kids were running around the yard, playing tag and enjoying the sunny day. It was a perfect afternoon, and Robert Thompson, the father, couldn't help but feel proud as he watched his family enjoy the celebration. Robert had been working hard all week to make sure everything went perfectly. He had marinated the steaks the night before, carefully selecting the best cuts of meat from the local butcher. He had spent hours arranging the seating, making sure there was enough space for everyone to enjoy the food and each other's company. The backyard was set up with colorful decorations, balloons, and a few tables where people could relax and eat. It was the perfect setting for a relaxing day with loved ones. Elizabeth, his wife, was busy preparing the side dishes. She hummed happily as she set up the picnic table with plates of potato salad, corn on the cob, and fresh fruit. The family was in a celebratory mood, as they didn't often get the chance to have everyone together at once. The kids were running through sprinklers, trying to cool off, while their parents chatted and laughed together. The backyard was lively and full of joy. Robert felt content, looking around at the people he loved. It wasn't often that they all had a chance to get together, so he made sure everything was perfect. He walked around, greeting his guests, checking that everyone had enough to drink, and making sure the food was cooking just right. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of clinking glasses and friendly conversations filled the air. But even in the middle of such a happy occasion, Robert couldn't help but notice something that had changed. There was a feeling of unease in the air, but it wasn't because of anything his family was doing. No, the unease seemed to come from somewhere else. From the house next door, Robert noticed Mr. Harris, the neighbor, standing in his window. Robert had known Mr. Harris for years. He was a quiet man who kept to himself and rarely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood. In fact, Mr. Harris had never once come to a single neighborhood gathering or BBQ. Robert had always wondered why. But today there was something different about the way Mr. Harris was looking at the party. His eyes were narrowed, and he didn't look happy. Robert tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe it was just the heat, or perhaps Mr. Harris had a long day. Still, he couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. They had always gotten along well with Mr. Harris, but his presence now felt more distant, almost cold. Then, Robert noticed Mr. Harris reach for his phone. The smile on his face quickly faded as he stared at his neighbor, still standing at his window. Robert watched for a moment, wondering what Mr. Harris was doing. But before he could even process it, he saw Mr. Harris make a quick motion, as though he was dialing a number. Robert's unease grew. He couldn't help but wonder if Mr. Harris was calling the police. A few moments passed, and Robert tried to focus back on the fun, not wanting to let a possible misunderstanding ruin the day. But in the back of his mind, he kept thinking about Mr. Harris. It wasn't like him to make a scene, but Robert had seen the stern look in his eyes. Could it be that he was upset about the noise? But they weren't being loud. It was just a family gathering, no more than what any other neighbor might have. Still, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Elizabeth noticed Robert standing still, staring at the window, and she walked over to him. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Robert shook his head slightly. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I think Mr. Harris is upset about the noise. He keeps staring at us from his window. And now he's on his phone. It's like he's calling someone." Elizabeth frowned. "Well, it's not like we're doing anything wrong. You've planned this for weeks. Maybe he's just not used to all the activity." "I hope you're right," Robert replied, trying to shake off the feeling. "But something about the way he's acting is just strange." Elizabeth nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it, Robert. Let's enjoy the day. If he has a problem, He'll talk to us. Robert took a deep breath and forced a smile. Yeah, you're right. Let's just have fun. But even as the day continued, the thought of Mr. Harris lingered in Robert's mind. It was supposed to be a carefree afternoon, but his sense of unease remained. He glanced at the window again. But this time, Mr. Harris was nowhere to be seen. Maybe it was all in his head, he thought. Maybe Mr. Harris wasn't upset at all. Little did he know, his worst fear was about to come true. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the Thompson family BBQ. Laughter and music filled the air as people relaxed, ate, and enjoyed each other's company. Robert had almost forgotten about Mr. Harris and his strange behavior earlier. The kids were now playing a game of tug-of-war, while Elizabeth handed out slices of watermelon to the guests. It felt like the perfect ending to a perfect day. But just as the evening was winding down, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance interrupted the cheerful atmosphere. Robert turned to see a squad car pulling up to the driveway, its lights flashing. His stomach dropped. The police. At his BBQ. It didn't make sense. His heart raced as Officer Martinez stepped out of the car and approached him. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson." Officer Martinez greeted him, her voice polite but firm. "Evening, officer," Robert replied, his confusion clear in his voice. "Is there a problem?" Officer Martinez glanced at the backyard, where the party was still going strong. She then looked back at Robert with a raised eyebrow. "We received a noise complaint," she said, keeping her tone professional. "Is everything okay here?" Robert's mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening. A noise complaint, but they weren't being loud. He had taken care to keep the volume at a reasonable level. "Noise complaint," he repeated, trying to process what was going on. "From who?" "From your neighbor, Mr. Harris," she said, her gaze scanning the yard once more. Apparently, the gathering is disturbing him. Robert felt a pang of frustration. He had worked so hard to make this day perfect, and now it was being interrupted. But he knew he had to stay calm. "Officer, with all due respect, we're just having a family BBQ. No one is causing trouble." I don't understand why he would call about something so trivial. Officer Martinez's expression softened, but she still seemed bound by her duty. "I understand, Mr. Thompson, but I still need to investigate. It's my job." As Robert stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, Officer Martinez stepped onto the grass and took a few steps toward the BBQ area. The sounds of chatter and laughter grew quieter as everyone stopped to look at her. A few awkward glances were exchanged. The tension in the air thickened. Elizabeth, noticing the situation, walked over to Robert. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Robert could see the worry in her eyes. "Mr. Harris called the police," he said quietly. "He said we're being too loud." Elizabeth's eyebrows furrowed. "But we've always had these BBQs. Why now?" Robert didn't have an answer. He glanced at Mr. Harris' house, but there was no sign of him. The curtains in his window were drawn, and the lights were off. Was he hiding, or had he already gone to bed? The quiet murmur of the party guests filled the silence, their eyes flicking from Robert to Officer Martinez. Everyone was confused, and some looked uneasy. Robert couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Why was this happening now, of all times? After what felt like an eternity, Officer Martinez returned to Robert, a clipboard in hand. "I've spoken with Mr. Harris. He claims the noise is excessive and disruptive. I'm going to have to ask you to keep it down for the rest of the evening," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Robert was taken aback. "What? No way. This is absurd. We've done nothing wrong." "I don't see any problem here," Robert said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "We've been doing this for years, and no one's ever complained." Chief Miller turned to Mr. Harris, who was standing rigidly on his porch. The chief gave him a long, assessing look, clearly wondering why the complaint had been made in the first place. "So, Mr. Harris," the chief said, his tone sharp, You've called the police about this gathering every year." Mr. Harris stiffened but nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice cold. "And it's gotten worse every year. It's too much noise, too much disruption." Robert's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. This is just a family BBQ. There's nothing excessive happening." But Chief Miller was still taking it all in. He seemed to be weighing his options carefully. He wasn't about to let emotions get in the way of the facts. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Thompson, but I'll need to check the situation to make sure there's no disturbance," he said, his voice soft but firm. As the chief took a few steps closer to the backyard, Robert couldn't help but feel that things were quickly getting out of hand. He was a man of principle, and he had always worked hard to keep his family's reputation intact. But now, standing in front of the police chief and his neighbor, he realized that his family's BBQ had turned into something far more serious. The silence in the air was deafening. Guests had stopped what they were doing, looking nervously at one another, unsure of what to say or do. The laughter had died down, replaced with the sound of whispers and uneasy glances. Robert could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to take control of the situation. Chief Miller walked slowly around the backyard, his hands behind his back. He glanced over the food, the guests, the decorations, and the laughter that still lingered in the air. Robert held his breath, watching the chief's every move. This was his backyard, his family's gathering, and now it felt like everything was being put under a microscope. Finally, Chief Miller stopped near the grill and turned back to Mr. Harris, who was still standing stiffly on his porch, his arms folded across his chest. "It seems to me that there's nothing out of the ordinary here," the chief said, his voice neutral. "This is a family gathering, and it's not causing any significant disturbance." Mr. Harris's face reddened, and he stepped off the porch, walking toward the fence with quick strides. "That's not true," he insisted. "It's too loud. It always is." Robert felt his patience running thin. "You've called the cops every year, haven't you, Mr. Harris?" he asked, his voice now rising slightly. "Why? Why keep causing problems for us?" Chief Miller held up a hand, signaling for Robert to remain calm. "Mr. Thompson, let's not escalate this." Mr. Harris ignored Robert's question and turned to the police chief. "You can't ignore the fact that they're disturbing the peace. This is a residential area. People need to be respectful of their neighbors." "I'm being respectful, Mr. Harris," Robert said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "We've always kept things reasonable. It's not our fault if you don't like a little noise every once in a while." Chief Miller, sensing the rising conflict, cleared his throat. "All right, gentlemen, let's all take a step back. I'll make a call and get everything sorted. But for now, Mr. Harris, you'll need to lower your expectations about what's appropriate for a neighborhood gathering. People have a right to celebrate in their own yards." Mr. Harris looked furious, but he said nothing as he turned and walked back to his porch. He slammed the door behind him, signaling that the argument was over for now. With the situation cooling down, Robert let out a long breath. He looked around at his guests, who were still standing in awkward silence, unsure of what to do next. Robert quickly realized that the damage had already been done. The BBQ, which had once been filled with joy and laughter, now felt like an uncomfortable gathering of strangers. The fun was gone, replaced with an air of tension that would be hard to shake. As the police cars slowly pulled away, Robert felt a strange sense of relief. The immediate threat had passed, but in the back of his mind, he knew that this was far from over. There was something about Mr. Harris's behavior that didn't sit right with him. What was really going on? What did he want from all of this? With the situation finally de-escalating, Robert gathered his family and friends to continue the BBQ. But the mood had changed. As night fell, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harris was hiding something. The next day, Robert woke up early, the events of the previous evening still weighing heavily on his mind. The sun was shining brightly, and the air felt fresh, But something about the calmness of the morning only seemed to highlight how tense things had been the night before. The memory of the argument with Mr. Harris, the arrival of Chief Miller, and the uncomfortable silence that followed his neighbor's complaint replayed in Robert's mind. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, trying to shake off the lingering frustration. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harris and his odd behavior. The more Robert thought about it, the more he realized something didn't add up. It was just a neighborhood BBQ, yet Mr. Harris had gone to extreme lengths to ruin it. Calling the police every year. That wasn't normal. Why would he act this way? Elizabeth walked into the kitchen, looking as though she hadn't slept well either. "I don't understand, Robert," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Why would Mr. Harris make such a big deal out of something so small? He's been our neighbor for years. It's not like this is the first time we've had a BBQ." Robert rubbed his temples. "I know, Liz. It just doesn't make sense. And the way he reacted last night, there was something off about it. It's like he was waiting for a chance to cause trouble." Elizabeth sat down beside him, her gaze steady. "Maybe he's just a cranky neighbor. Some people don't like noise, especially at night." "Maybe," Robert said, though he wasn't convinced. "But what if there's more to it? What if he's trying to send a message? I don't know. Something feels wrong." Just as Robert was about to speak again, the phone rang, breaking the tension in the air. Robert grabbed it, his eyes narrowing as he saw the number on the screen. It was the police department. "Hello," he answered, his voice a little sharp from the stress of the past day. "Mr. Thompson, this is Officer Martinez from the precinct. We've been looking into the incident from last night, and we think you should be aware of something," the officer said, her tone serious. "Something else." Robert's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, sir. It turns out that Mr. Harris has a history of making false complaints. We've had reports from other neighbors in the past about him making similar noise complaints, but when we investigated, we found no evidence of any disturbance." Robert's eyes widened as the information sank in. "Wait, are you telling me he does this all the time?" "Unfortunately, yes, and we've just received word that there may be more to this than just complaints about noise. We're digging deeper into his background now," Officer Martinez explained. Robert's mind was racing. It wasn't just about the BBQ anymore. Mr. Harris had been making false complaints for years. What was he trying to achieve? Was it just petty revenge, or was there something darker at play? "Thank you for letting me know, officer. Please keep me updated," Robert said, trying to keep his voice calm. As he hung up, a mix of relief and frustration washed over him. It seemed like Mr. Harris had a history of stirring up trouble for no reason, but that didn't explain why he'd targeted Robert's family in particular. "I knew something wasn't right," Robert muttered to himself. Elizabeth looked up at him. "What do we do now?" Robert stood up from the table, a sense of determination settling in. "We need to figure out why Mr. Harris is doing this, and we need to make sure this never happens again." Later that day, Robert found himself walking back to his neighbor's house, this time with a new purpose. The situation had changed. It wasn't just a misunderstanding about a BBQ anymore. There was something deeper going on, and Robert wasn't going to let it slide. His family and his reputation were at stake. As he approached the fence that separated his yard from Mr. Harris' property, he hesitated for a moment. But then, with a deep breath, he called out, "Mr. Harris, we need to talk." There was no immediate response. Robert waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next wouldn't be as simple as just confronting his neighbor. Something had changed. This wasn't about a noise complaint anymore. After a long pause, the door to Mr. Harris's house creaked open. Robert could see him standing there, arms crossed, a scowl on his face. "What do you want, Thompson?" Mr. Harris growled. "We need to talk about last night," Robert said firmly. "You've been making false complaints for years, and I want to know why." Mr. Harris' expression hardened, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You don't know anything about me, Robert. You don't know the full story." "What story?" Robert pressed, frustration rising. "All I know is you've been causing problems for me and my family for no reason." Mr. Harris's eyes flickered for a moment, like he was deciding whether or not to reveal something. Then, without warning, he spoke in a low, almost ominous tone. "You'll find out soon enough. You have no idea what you're really dealing with." Robert's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced with questions, but before he could ask another thing, Mr. Harris turned and slammed the door shut. The air felt thick with tension. Robert stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his mind spinning. What was Mr. Harris trying to say? And what did he mean by, "You have no idea what you're really dealing with"? Suddenly, Robert had a sinking feeling. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Robert woke up with a sense of urgency in his chest. He couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Mr. Harris the day before. The words, "You have no idea what you're really dealing with," echoed in his mind, leaving a gnawing sense of unease. Whatever Mr. Harris was hiding, Robert knew he had to get to the bottom of it. After a quick breakfast, Robert decided to stop by the police station again. He had received a troubling tip from Officer Martinez the day before, and he needed more answers. The fact that Mr. Harris had been making false complaints for years didn't sit right with him. What was his motivation? Was he just a difficult neighbor, or was there something more sinister at play? Robert had to find out. As Robert walked through the doors of the station, the familiar smell of coffee and the sound of distant chatter greeted him. He made his way straight to the front desk, where Officer Martinez was stationed. She looked up from her paperwork as he approached. "Mr. Thompson, good to see you again." Officer Martinez greeted him, her tone warm but professional. "What can I help you with today?" "I need to know more about Mr. Harris," Robert said, his voice low but urgent. "I think there's something I'm missing. You mentioned he has a history of false complaints, but what else do you know about him?" Officer Martinez's expression shifted slightly, and she glanced around the room, as though making sure no one was listening. "Harris is a complicated individual. He's been a problem for a long time, not just here, but in other areas of town as well. We've received multiple complaints over the years, all of which turned out to be exaggerated or outright false. But there's something else, something darker." Robert leaned in, eager for any information. "What do you mean by something darker?" "Mr. Harris has been involved in a few shady dealings that we've been keeping an eye on," Officer Martinez explained quietly. "Nothing concrete, but we've had reports of him being connected to some local businesses that deal in, let's say, less than legal activities." A chill ran down Robert's spine. "Are you telling me that he's involved in crime?" "We're not sure yet," Officer Martinez said, her voice serious. "But there are rumors, and the way he's been acting lately, especially with your family, makes us wonder if he's trying to intimidate you for some reason. It's possible he's trying to push people away or create distractions while he's involved in something bigger." Robert felt his stomach drop. So this isn't just about a noisy BBQ. This could be something much bigger. "Exactly," Officer Martinez said. "I'd recommend keeping an eye on him. And if you notice anything strange, anything that doesn't sit right with you, let us know immediately. This might be more dangerous than we initially thought." Robert nodded, his mind racing. He had thought Mr. Harris was just a petty neighbor trying to cause trouble. But now, it seemed like there was more to the story than he had imagined. Was he really involved in criminal activity? And what was his connection to Robert's family? "Thank you for this information," Robert said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll keep an eye on him, and I'll make sure my family stays safe." As Robert left the police station, his thoughts were clouded with worry. If Mr. Harris was really involved in something illegal, Robert knew that his family was in danger. He had to protect them. But he also had to understand why Mr. Harris had targeted them in the first place. What was his motive? Later that evening, Robert found himself back in his backyard, pacing. His family was inside, going about their business, but his mind was consumed with the thought of what to do next. The peaceful neighborhood BBQ seemed so far removed from the danger that was now closing in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Elizabeth. She had sent a picture of something strange. A man standing near Mr. Harris's house, looking suspicious. Robert's heart skipped a beat. The man in the photo didn't look like anyone Robert recognized. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses, standing just outside Mr. Harris's fence. His posture was rigid, and he seemed to be watching the house intently. Was Mr. Harris involved with people like this? And why were they watching his home? Robert's hands trembled as he typed a quick response to Elizabeth. "Stay inside. I'll be home soon. Don't open the door to anyone." His mind was spinning. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just a casual passerby. There was something purposeful in his movements. Was he a part of whatever Mr. Harris was involved in? And what did this mean for Robert and his family? As Robert rushed back toward his house, he realized just how deep this situation had gotten. What started as a simple neighborhood dispute had escalated into something far more dangerous. Mr. Harris wasn't just a bad neighbor. He was part of something bigger, something Robert was now entangled in. And he had no idea how far this would go. The only thing Robert knew for sure was that he wasn't going to back down. Whatever Mr. Harris was up to, Robert would find out, and he would make sure his family was protected, no matter the cost. The next day, Robert found himself lying awake in bed, unable to shake the events that had unfolded. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear, but also determination. There was no turning back now. He had uncovered too much, and he needed answers. Elizabeth had been on edge since she'd seen that strange man outside Mr. Harris's house, and Robert knew she was worried. He tried to keep the tension out of their home, but the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. With every passing hour, he felt the walls closing in around them. His family was in danger, and it was only a matter of time before things got worse. Robert had spent the night planning his next steps. He couldn't just sit idly by, hoping things would resolve themselves. He had to act. The first thing he needed to do was gather more information. The more he knew about Mr. Harris and his shady connections, the better he could protect his family. And to do that, he needed to confront his neighbor once again. But this time, he wasn't going to walk up to the door unprepared. Robert had contacted a private investigator, someone who could dig into Mr. Harris's background and help him uncover the truth. The investigator had promised to be discreet and thorough. With any luck, Robert would have the answers he was looking for soon. Just as Robert was about to get up, there was a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat as he turned to look at Elizabeth, who was standing in the hallway, a worried expression on her face. "Who could that be?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Robert stood up, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't have any good answers, but he couldn't leave Elizabeth in the dark either. He walked to the door slowly, glancing back at her one last time for reassurance. When Robert opened the door, he was met with a surprise. There, standing in front of him, was Officer Martinez. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced with something more serious. Her eyes were scanning the yard behind him, her hand resting on her holster. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice low. "We need to talk." "Of course, officer. What's going on?" Robert stepped aside, letting her enter. "I've got news about Mr. Harris," Officer Martinez began, her eyes scanning the room. "We've been doing some digging, and it turns out he's been involved in a series of illegal activities. There's more to him than just being a bad neighbor." Robert's pulse quickened. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it out loud still sent a chill through him. "What kind of activities?" "We're not sure yet, but we've traced a few financial transactions that lead to some questionable sources, and it looks like he's tied to a local gang." "This goes deeper than just neighborhood complaints," she said, lowering her voice even more. Robert's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about a noisy BBQ anymore. Mr. Harris was involved in something far more dangerous. "Do you have enough evidence to arrest him?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're still working on it," Officer Martinez replied. "But what concerns us right now is that Mr. Harris knows we're onto him. He's become more erratic recently, and we're worried that he might try something drastic to cover his tracks." The weight of her words hit Robert hard. If Mr. Harris was already aware that the police were investigating him, who knew what lengths he would go to in order to protect himself? And if Robert was in the middle of it all, what kind of danger were his family and friends in? "I need to keep my family safe," Robert said, his voice firm. "What should I do?" "I recommend staying vigilant," Officer Martinez said. "And don't confront Harris directly again. He's unpredictable, and we don't want to put you in harm's way. We'll continue to monitor the situation. But right now, we're focused on gathering more evidence. We'll keep you updated." Robert nodded, but deep down, he knew that this wasn't just going to blow over. It wasn't about his BBQ anymore. Mr. Harris was part of something bigger, and Robert's family had unknowingly become a part of it. As Officer Martinez left, Robert's mind was spinning. How much longer could they hide from this danger? What was Mr. Harris capable of? He couldn't just wait around for things to escalate. He needed to protect his family and get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. But that wasn't going to be easy. He had already seen how quickly things could turn dangerous. The last time he tried to confront Mr. Harris, it only led to more tension. This time, Robert couldn't afford to be reckless. He had to think carefully about every move he made. And then, as if on cue, Robert's phone buzzed. It was the private investigator he had hired earlier that morning. "Mr. Thompson," the investigator said, his voice muffled slightly through the phone. "I've got some information on Harris that might help you. Meet me tonight, and we'll go over everything. It's urgent." Robert's heart skipped a beat. It was finally happening. The answers he had been waiting for were within his reach. But with each passing moment, the stakes were getting higher. The more Robert uncovered about Mr. Harris, the more he realized that the truth was darker than he had ever imagined. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something dangerous, and Robert had no choice but to dive deeper into it. Tonight, he would meet with the investigator. And whatever came next, he had to be ready. That evening, as Robert sat in his car outside the meeting place, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days. The quiet neighborhood, the peaceful BBQ, and the simple life he had once known. All of it seemed so far removed from the dangerous world he was now tangled up in. Every minute that passed felt like it was bringing him closer to something he couldn't escape. He glanced at his phone one last time, checking for any updates from Elizabeth or Officer Martinez. His mind raced as he thought about his family, who were safely at home but unaware of the full extent of the danger they were facing. What would they think if they knew the truth about Mr. Harris? And even more, what would they do when they found out how deep this went? The sound of the car door opening broke him from his thoughts, and Robert looked up to see the private investigator approach. The man was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his face was shadowed under the streetlights. He moved quickly, his expression serious. "Mr. Thompson," the investigator said, offering a brief handshake before sitting across from Robert. "I've got the information you asked for. It's a lot, but I think you need to hear all of it. Please, just tell me what you found," Robert urged, his voice tight. His anxiety was mounting as he prepared to hear what would likely change everything. The investigator pulled out a folder from his bag and handed it over. "I've done a thorough background check on Mr. Harris. His name isn't as clean as it seems. Over the years, he's been involved in multiple legal disputes, some of them tied to property ownership scams. But what's more concerning is his recent activity." Robert's heart raced as he flipped through the papers, each document more troubling than the last. What kind of activity? He's been meeting with individuals linked to organized crime, the investigator said, lowering his voice. And it gets worse. Harris has been laundering money through local businesses. He's been using a series of shell companies to funnel cash, some of it from illegal activities. Robert's breath caught in his throat. This was no longer just a neighborhood problem. This was a full-blown criminal operation. Do you have any solid proof? Robert asked, his voice shaking now. We've got enough to make a case, the investigator replied. But it's going to take some time to gather everything we need. Harris is smart. He covers his tracks well. But if you want to stop him, we'll need your help. Robert sat back in his chair, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He hadn't imagined anything like this. What had started as a small dispute with a troublesome neighbor had now grown into a dangerous web of crime. So what do I do now? Robert asked, his voice firm with determination. How do I protect my family? The investigator's eyes met Robert's, his expression unreadable. You stay close to your family. Keep your eyes open for anything strange, anything that doesn't make sense. And most importantly, don't confront Harris directly. He's already aware that we're looking into him. He's dangerous, Robert. If he feels cornered, he could do anything. Robert nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He couldn't take any more risks. The last thing he wanted was for his family to get hurt because of his actions. As the meeting ended, Robert left the diner with a heavy heart, knowing that the path ahead was uncertain. He had learned the truth about Mr. Harris, but that truth was a double-edged sword. Now he had to figure out how to act without putting his loved ones in harm's way. He drove home slowly, lost in thought. The dark streets seemed to stretch out endlessly before him, mirroring the uncertainty he felt inside. Was he doing the right thing? Was he really ready to confront a man with so much power and influence? When he finally arrived home, Robert was relieved to find Elizabeth sitting on the porch, waiting for him. Her worried expression softened when she saw him pull into the driveway, but Robert could tell she was just as anxious as he was. Robert, she said quietly, standing up as he approached. Is everything okay? Robert hesitated for a moment before answering. He didn't want to scare her with the full extent of what he had learned, but he knew he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. Things are more complicated than I thought, he said, taking her hand. Mr. Harris isn't just some difficult neighbor. He's involved in something much bigger, and it's dangerous. We have to stay careful and stay together. Elizabeth's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, squeezing his hand. What do we do now? We stay alert, Robert said, his voice steady but resolute. We don't confront him. We let the police do their work, and we protect our family. But we also need to get ready for whatever comes next. As they stood there together, looking at the darkening sky, Robert knew that the coming days would test him in ways he couldn't predict. But one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to protect the ones he loved. The calm suburban life he once knew was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. But Robert was ready for it. And he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever.